One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. The Treasurer knows.
I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
G'day and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains big economic issues in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and for this episode of Follow the Money, we'll be listening back to an interview I did as part of a series of webinars hosted by the Australia Institute's Nordic Policy Centre as part of Nordic Talks. Nordic Talks brings together experts to discuss global challenges with a focus on Nordic policy. And in 2022, Australia dropped 14 places in the World Press Freedom Index, due in part to its highly concentrated media landscape. Norway, in contrast, is number one on the index and employs policies including targeted press support subsidies to protect public interest journalism. So what can Australia learn from Norway? And is there anything Norway can learn from Australia? I spoke with Professor Ellie Skogerbø, co-director of POLKOM, the Centre for Political Communication, professor at the Department of Media and Communication at the University of Oslo, and Dr. Maria Ray, senior lecturer in politics and policy at Deakin University. So what lessons can Australia learn from Norway's targeted press support subsidies, its support for public broadcasting and public interest journalism? And what lessons can Norway learn from Australia's world-leading news media bargaining code about regulating big tech platforms such as Google and Facebook? As we enter an age of mass disinformation, the role of public interest journalism is really more crucial than ever for a strong and informed democracy. So I'm delighted to introduce our two panellists today, Professor Ellie Skogerbø and Dr. Maria Ray. Professor Ellie Skogerbø is a professor at the Department of Media and Communication and co-director of POLKOM, the Centre for the Study of Political Communication at the University of Oslo. And with her permission, I hope I haven't butchered her surname, I'm going to call her Ellie for the rest of the webinar. And Dr. Maria Ray is a senior lecturer in politics and policy at Deakin University and a former newspaper journalist. She teaches and researches political communication and the media, and her interests include media and politics, political communication, the role of media in transitional justice, and the politics of human rights. Welcome, Maria and Ellie. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Ellie, I want to begin with you. For many people in Australia, to conceive of the idea of some of the inspiration that the Australia Institute has taken for its latest report that we've got up on our website about media policy and how to encourage media diversity, looking at Norway's example of permanent public subsidies to newspapers as a means of encouraging media diversity and competition, it's hard for Australians to imagine. We kind of think of it as being contrary to press freedom in some ways. Can you tell me how it is that the press support subsidies work and why they were first brought into being in the first place?
Yeah, I can try and make a short history and an outline of that. The press subsidies dates back to the 60s. And the situation at that time was that Norway had many newspapers at that time too, and it was very common that there were more newspapers issued in one locality. So that if you lived in a small town, it was quite common that you could choose between 1, 2, 3, 4 newspapers, and they would normally be alleged, not necessarily owned, but alleged to different parties. And this model started to actually fall apart, and there was a big worry that there would be a loss of diversity because some parties' voices wouldn't be heard when one newspaper monopolized the smaller market. So this press subsidy was actually a compromise formed in Parliament for it's actually a quite small direct subsidy to struggling newspapers. It started as being only available for the so-called number two, the ones who weren't dominating in local competition. But since the subsidies did not work to stop all monopolization in local areas, it's developed over time in two ways. One thing is that the party press has actually disappeared, not because it has been put down, but because the newspaper market did not support that model, and professional journalism developed an independence out of the party, what do you say, the party scene, the party market. So the original justification for the system disappeared, and it has been replaced by a justification that we need diversity whatsoever, and we need diversity in the newspaper market. So today you can get the subsidy both if you struggle in competition, but also if it's a local newspaper that has that is small in a local market. So it's about 200 newspapers now that get it, but not that get the subsidy, but in the market altogether. It has never been a subsidy that has been uncontroversial. It's always been controversial. It's decided on in Parliament, and it also is very often used in what should I say, trade-offs. Well, okay, you get some more press subsidies if we get the road. That's something that quite often happen, but it's been kept.
So if I can just summarise, you used to have quite a partisan newspaper business, and originally the subsidies were to help prop that up. But as journalism professionalised, the subsidies remained in place to ensure media diversity, but in a different way, for a more professional, independent press, and to make sure that even small places still have access to news. Yeah,
absolutely
okay.
correct.
And just to follow up on that a little bit, where do things stand now in terms of, I guess, support for them, given that Norway probably is still experiencing some of those issues of market failure with the business model of journalism being really difficult in a digital age?
You're absolutely right about. No, the press subsidies are there, and the direct subsidies are a small part of all media subsidies, as they are called now. We also have a VAT exemption and things like that. All these things are debated here too, and of course, Norwegian media, as media everywhere, is leaking a lot of advertising income to the big tech giants. It's been a long-term discussion. There are lots of things going on. As I said when we talked earlier, Norway is not the paradise. Neither are the other countries, but it's kept for the time being. I don't see that the direct subsidies will lose out, but the VAT exemption is now under debate. So we will see. And that's a much bigger subsidy.
All right. Maria, if I can come to you next, because you co-authored the report that the Nordic Policy Centre has just put out today, and kind of based on a chapter from the Nordic Edge, the book published a year or two ago. What are some of the reasons that it's so important to look at the way other countries such as Norway, that, even though it's not a paradise, as Ellie says, is number one in the Press Freedom Index, considering Australia's ultra-concentrated market? What are some of the things that you think it's important for Australia to be considering as we review media policy?
Thanks, Ebony. And I was interested to hear from Ellie that it has been a controversial policy. As you said, we have had an ultra-concentrated media landscape here in Australia. Reporters Without Borders has actually called us an oligarchy. So historically, we had those three families, the Packers, the Murdochs and the Fairfaxes, dominate. And there's really been no political appetite or will to break up that domination. So it's really important for us to look at different media policies that have worked overseas, perhaps even with controversy, to see how we can create more diversity. Because the interventions that we have had under former Prime Minister Paul Keating, we had the cross-media ownership laws where you could be queens of the screen or princes of print. That only served to actually increase concentration. And it's one of the main reasons that we have slipped down the Press Freedom Index, is because of the lack of diversity, particularly in our newspaper market. But there is, I think, now an appetite to, especially since COVID, where we have seen so many newspaper organisations close, especially in local regional areas where communities are facing a news desert. There has been more consideration of what we can do to increase diversity, even starting with coalition government, who provided some funding support for small organisations. And now we have the new government announcing reviews into the sustainability of the ABC funding and also how to better support, give long-term support to community and regional organisations. So it makes sense to look at other countries and what they're doing for sort of a best model approach.
Ellie, coming back to you and thinking about how these subsidies work, and I know, you've said there's some other bigger ones, but I think people would be interested in kind of how they've evolved over time. So you've said in the past they were offered to kind of the second biggest newspaper in an area, but is there any other criteria attached to that? Like, do they have to report news, and are they subsidies for news reporters or for the production of news? Can you tell us a little bit how the press support, now media support, works?
It works fairly the way you say. We have a media authority who administrates the direct press support, and for a newspaper to be eligible for press subsidies, it has to have been up and running for a year. Minimum, and it has to have news. That's quite often debated. So it has to have some public news, and this is where press freedom and intervention actually. But there are some quite clear criteria. When you said the second largest, what I meant is we call it the number two papers. It means that if there is competition in a local area, and it's very few places left, you might be eligible, and if you are not the dominant one, that's the number two. It's not the number two, but every newspaper that is not dominating. But also, as I said, small local newspapers are eligible if they fulfill these other criteria, and obviously you also have to have a minimum subscriber market. So I think the reason why they have survived a lot of debate over time is that there are enough interest in diversity in the political system. We have a little bit of a different political system than Australia, which means we have many parties in parliament. So there is always a trade-off between different interests. So as long as you can muster a majority for maintaining press subsidies, they are in place, and that has been the case now for how long is it? More than 50 years, and that still seems to be going on. And I think the legitimation of diversity as a media political objective, and that objective has been stable for a very, very long time, even though the means, the subsidies, the ways we organize the media market. We also had laws, for instance, against media concentration once upon a time, They have been abolished, and we do have concentration, but not to the same degree as Australia. It's lower. But these objectives of diversity and also freedom of expression, freedom of the press, and I also think the independent press council, which secures press ethics and works as a complaints organ, could we say that? That's independent of the state. I think all these things work together. So when you discuss one of these bits and pieces of state support, there are also other pieces that fit in to create the independence that is, of course, crucial.
Yeah.
Which is also, I think, crucial to the fact that we actually end up on top on the press freedom list for this year.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question, is about being on the top of the press freedom index, because you have some different infrastructure in place in Norway to Australia. We don't have freedom of speech or expression or freedom of the press enshrined in our constitution, for example. What are some of the ways or some of the reasons why Norway, despite not being a paradise, as you've said, remains at the top of the press freedom index? How institutionally is freedom of the press supported?
It's an extremely important value, I should say, and objective and I think it spans much more than media policy. It's enshrined in the old constitution for that was actually put up in 1814, and even though it didn't secure independence, I think it secured that freedom of expression was integrated and implemented in Norwegian law as early as that. It's not. There are different systems in the Nordic countries, but it's very central to everything. So the constitution, there is also a separate law for editorial freedom that says that every media should have editorial freedom. We always debate whether social media are media and so on and so forth. Norway is a very pragmatic kind of community, or society. So these things are solved either in the courts or by pragmatic negotiations. But the editorial freedom, the as I said, the independent press council, and also the governance by arm's length, as it's called, which applies, of course, to broadcasting, to the public broadcaster, but also to this system of press subsidies. It's enshrined in several institutional solutions. I think that's very, very central. It also makes a room for political agency in there, because you always have this strong debate on, or strong emphasis on freedom of expression and freedom of the press and so on. So, yeah.
Thank you. So, Maria, obviously we don't have that same type of infrastructure underpinning freedom of the press in Australia. And as you've said, with the pandemic, that really hastened the closures, particularly of a lot of local newsrooms in regional and remote areas. And we were already a highly concentrated media market. So the government, as I understand it, is currently looking at media policy and ways to improve media diversity. But thinking about ways to support that brings us back, I think, to the News Media Bargaining Code as something that the previous government tried. Can you tell us a little bit about the News Media Bargaining Code and what that has achieved so far?
Yeah, I think this was probably the most significant intervention into media policy that we've seen for some time. And I think it showed a real commitment to public interest journalism. So in 2020, the Australian Consumer and Competition Commission suggested this idea of a mandatory media bargaining code, which would force the big tech companies like Facebook and Google to actually compensate Australian media organisations for the content that they used on their platforms. So they were reaping all the rewards of this content from the advertising revenue, but not having to bear the costs of the labour of journalism. It was legislated in 2021 and had its first year of being implemented last year. It's had some success. There's been more than 30 agreements signed between Facebook and Google and media organisations. Google has coughed up more. Facebook is lagging behind a bit on that. And it's estimated that these deals are worth more than $200 million a year. So it has had some success. The ABC have reported that they've employed, I think, nearly 60 journalists because of this code into regional areas. The Guardian has also reported that they've increased their staff. There are some flaws with it. There is a bit of lack of transparency and accountability there about how news organisations are using this money, and it has been criticised for excluding smaller local and independent media organisations who don't really have the power to negotiate with these big companies, and even including SBS has been left out of deals. But I think it's a really positive move towards correcting that market imbalance and providing a long-term solution for media organisations. And other countries such as Canada and the UK and India, I think, are following our lead and looking at their own codes.
Ellie, you might have seen at the time, both Facebook and Google really retaliated quite strongly against Australia implementing this code. At one point, there was a blackout of news sites on Facebook, and Google was running a lot of ads on YouTube, kind of attacking it. Did you see much of that in Norway? And what, if anything, did Norway make of Australia's efforts on this front?
I think we were just totally impressed and taken aback with, oh, is this really possible? It had been discussed in the Norwegian media and journalism spheres, both that the drainage of news and content and advertising income to the tech giants was something that also the censorship that several media actually experienced from Facebook and Google. So there had been a big debate about it, but I don't think anybody saw that coming, that it actually would be possible for one government to take action and actually go through with it. So we don't have anything that resembles that, and I can only congratulate on that. I think it's only fair, and I think we all would want it. But in that matter, the Nordic countries, which have separate majority languages and also quite a few minority languages, we don't actually make up that interest, that an interesting market for. So not the same power.
We'll move on to questions from the audience very shortly, but I wanted to finish on public broadcasting, because I know how important that is to Nordic countries. And equally in Australia, the ABC here is often, always the most trusted media organisation in the country. Public broadcasting is also supported in Nordic countries because of the interest of public interest journalism, as part of a healthy democracy. Can you just tell us a little bit about why it's valued and how public interest journalism, or public broadcasting, is supported in Norway and perhaps any other Nordic countries you'd like to reflect on?
It's been around since the 1930s in Norway, a little bit earlier in the other Nordic countries. We have just changed the financing from license fees to taxes, but it's an arrangement that is protected from constant bargaining. It's the NRK, as it's called, the Norwegian Broadcasting Company, very perhaps the same name as everybody else has a broad remit. And the main important things is to represent the Norwegian society, and that is the society within Norwegian borders. I think the NRK actually does that. It presents the increasing diversity, I should say, and also they also have indigenous ports. We don't have an indigenous channel as you have, but we have an indigenous editorial room in the Norwegian, Swedish, and Finnish broadcasters. And in Denmark, there are separate companies for on Greenland, for instance. It's very much about diversity, democracy, but also very, very much about language. Since Norwegian is not the language spoken by very many people in the world, we couldn't expect that. We have to have production in Norwegian and also in Sami, which is actually many languages, but it's the indigenous language. So that's part of the remit that the public broadcasters should do. And of course, they should have a broad programming. As elsewhere, there is always attacks on this, that the public broadcaster does too much that seems to be commercial. They're online. It's the most one of the most popular also websites and streaming platforms and so on. But it enjoys a lot of support and also trust. And as most places, the public broadcaster also increased its trust during the pandemic, but so did all the other news media. So news media really had a boom during the pandemic, and it's still holding up most of that, but not quite, I think.
Maria, coming back to you and Australia and the ABC. ABC funding is obviously a political football quite often in Australia. But if we look at Australia compared to the Nordic countries, we actually spend way less on public broadcasting overall.
Yeah, so that's also one of the reasons that we have slid backwards in the Press Freedom Index. Reporters Without Borders have raised this as an issue, that the funding for the ABC has been cut over the years. And also, I noticed someone in the chat said there's also concerns about political appointments to the ABC board, so politicising the ABC board. So that's why I really welcome the new government's review into how to have a funding model that's sustainable and also bipartisan. They've also reinstated funding cuts from previous years, but I'd be quite interested to hear from our audience about whether they would stomach a licence fee as they have in other countries such as Norway and the UK. That might be something that comes up in this review, where anyone who owns a television has to pay an annual fee. And I'm not sure, even though Australians really do trust our ABC, whether they would be willing to do that. But that might be one option that the government looks at.
Yeah. Well, we might go now to questions from the audience. And please, if you've got a question for either Ellie or Maria, you can type it into the Q&A box and we'll try and get to as many as we can. So the first one I'm going to ask is from Tito, and this one will be for you, Ellie. The question is Norwegian press monolingual in general? And how does Norwegian media ownership laws work? So I think you made reference to that earlier. Yeah.
Thank you, Tito. The press is not totally monolingual. There is a small newspaper that publishes in Sami, northern Sami, that is. We also have some publishing in other Sami languages, and Sami and Norwegian is very different. But we also have two variants of Norwegian. Since we are so small, we need two variants of our language. So we have newspapers publishing in both the most used and the minority version of that. When it comes to those ownership anti-concentration laws, they were abolished in 2012, I think, and kind of replaced by competition laws. So when there is a buyer, the competition authority always have to look at it. But there are no the laws as such have gone. Sorry.
I think there's a couple of people in here asking about how much the subsidies are worth to the media in Norway, but also about how Australia's funding compares to Norway's funding for public broadcasting. And I might give Ellie some time to think about if she knows the cost of subsidies in total, how much they cost. But I know when it comes to public broadcasting, Australia spends about half of what Finland spends per capita on public broadcasting, and about 1/3 of what Norway spends on public broadcasting per capita. So running the old ABC pretty cheaply by comparison, and SBS and ITV. Ellie, I'm not sure that you'll have that to hand, but do you know how much the subsidies are to the media are worth around about?
If you look at the direct subsidies, what we actually call the production subsidies, they vary a little bit, but they're usually not that much. And I'm trying now to calculate in Australian dollars. As Norwegian kroner, it would be plus minus 300 million. So maybe some between 300 and 400 million now. And one Norwegian kroner, one Australian dollar is worth 6 kroner. So for those of you who are good at calculating, you can find out that it's not much money. But the total media subsidies, which go is several billion. I'm not quite sure, 6, 7, something like that. But if I would have to look that up to get the correct figures. But there's a big difference. And it's also a fun fact is that the direct subsidies are always much more debated, the small ones, than the big the big cake. But that's, I guess, like also in every country. Yeah,
that's right. And one more follow-up question specifically on the subsidies. Philip Durham has asked Ellie if the press subsidies apply to online newspapers as opposed to actual print newspapers.
That's a great question, and it's been that's been debated for at least a decade, maybe more. Originally, it was only print, but some years ago it was changed so that also digital newspapers can be supported, and most local newspapers actually are hybrid. They may come out on paper for 1 day, 2 days a week, and then they are online, have online issues the rest of the week. So yes. So the answer is yes. It's open for both, but you still have to fill those criteria of being that there has to be news production, and there are
yeah. The next question I've got is probably for you, Maria. It's from Roman Orzansky. And their question is, should we worry about cuts to the ABC budget from Conservatives and the targeting of the ABC by Murdoch and others? That's a bit of a hairy question there, but...
Yes, we should. I think that's the point of this review that the Labor government are doing at the moment, is how can we actually take politics out of the funding and appointment of the ABC board, which I think is incredibly difficult to do. And I think historically it has been Conservative governments and the Murdoch press that have criticised the ABC or caused the funding cuts. But I'm hopeful, maybe I'm being a bit glass half full here, that this review might actually put in some protections from all sides of politics, so they have some security.
Yeah. And for what it's worth, Ellie, I think you were saying, that sometimes your public broadcasters are attacked for venturing too much into the commercial news space. We have a lot of those same criticisms of our public broadcasters, SBS and ABC and ITV here as well. But as you said, trust for the ABC and a lot of news did go very well during the pandemic, and it still is the most trusted. The ABC also is our emergency broadcaster. So during a lot of natural disasters, that's where people can find their information about, evacuations for bushfires or floods or whatnot. So it really does play a huge role, particularly in rural and regional Australia, where sometimes there's not much access to news elsewhere. The next question that I've got is around concentrated media. And so Kevin Judah White, and I might put this to both of you, but I'll start with you, Ellie, says, does having less concentrated media outlets necessarily mean more diverse viewpoints? If the profit motive is the governing principle, can't it just mean more of the same? Ellie, do you want to answer that one first?
Yeah, and if I answer that correctly, I will be very rich, I think, because that's one of the that's one of the most debated media political issues that we have. I think that's been on the table for as long as I've been in business, and probably much longer. Does diversity in outlets actually create diversity in opinions? And I think if I'm going to be a proper Norwegian now and say, we think so. At least we don't take the chance that if we reduce diversity, and when diversity is reduced, we think that there will be a chance that also opinions will be lost out. But of course, also the media's landscape has changed fundamentally over the past 50, 30, 20, however you want to. There are many more outlets for everything. So we also have the struggling with that. So the short answer is you can never be absolutely sure, but securing different types of outlets and also securing professional quality journalistic outlets, we hope produce more diversity. And we do have all kinds of newspapers and media that are not necessarily present everywhere else. So it does have some effect, I think.
Yeah. Maria, did you want to take that one on too?
Yeah, I'd like to interpret that one as cultural diversity, because the Press Freedom Index also mentioned that a problem with Australia's media is that it can be racist and sexist. And so I know that Norway is pretty good at subsidising Sami or Indigenous media, and I've seen people in the chat also mention SBS and NITV and Koori Mail, and I think that Australia could really improve the diversity of voices through a diversity of outlets in that way.
And it is a really interesting observation, because with digital media, obviously, there's a lot lower barrier to entry for startups, essentially. Starting an online newspaper is a lot easier than starting a print one. But, it's very hard to compete against the established media. So you might be able to introduce something new, but then, can it actually gain a big share of the voice is another question entirely. And in Australia, I think we've had great success with a lot of new papers and online starting up and things like that, but they've had a very mixed history of success. So something like Guardian Australia has gone really well, whereas Huffington Post tried something quite similar and didn't. And the Saturday paper, started up a whole new actual printed newspaper and has done pretty well. So yeah, it's still a bit of a mixed bag there. But that point about cultural diversity is really important. And Ellie, you were also talking about the importance of language, which again, in Australia, so many languages are spoken here. So perhaps that element of supporting not just access to news, but access to news in your own language is something that the government will consider as part of its reviews. The next question that I've got is perhaps one to you both as journalism professionals about the difference between how Norway and Australia compare in attracting young journalists into the profession via cadetships or supported training and things like that. That might be a bit out of left field, but Ellie, would you like to answer that one first? How do young people, how are young people supported getting into journalism in Norway?
Oh, that's a difficult question, because I think we of course have journalism training, and it's also possible that still people also can be employed by a local newspaper, for instance, and have a kind of practical training. That's also, and go on to professional training and so on. So I'm not quite sure that I know all the ways, but it's a combination of academic and practical ways into employment. And as far as we thought, let's say, also media researchers thought 5 years ago that, oh no, the market for, or the labor market for journalists are more or less collapsing. As many times before, we were wrong. It's not collapsing now. There is hiring, and there are also new news media opening, as you said. Most of the new ones that are serious and successful are online. So I don't think I just might not know about everything, so I just say that this is what I know about it. Maybe Maria, you seem to be so updated. Maybe you know more about that.
No, this is what I don't know much about, or how we compare with Norway. I mean, I still see cadetships being advertised at the major news organisations, so I assume that there's still a dedicated targeting of getting young journalists in. And I know that one of the top political podcasts in Australia is actually run by two young people. I think it's called The Daily Oz, and they've been really successful. So I would love to see more young people just starting up their own news organisations, and if there was a way to support that, that would be terrific.
The next one that I've got is really just a comment from someone, and now that I've lost it in the chat, hang on, let me see if I can find it again. It's from someone who says they're the editor of a regional paper, and I was going to read it out and now I can't find it. Someone was commenting that they're an editor of a regional paper and they would like to see something similar to the Norwegian model implemented in Australia, but perhaps helping with the salaries for journalists, I believe was the comment. And that might link back to what you were saying, Maria, that we do know that a lot of news media organisations who are part of the bargaining code have employed more journalists, but there's not necessarily a huge amount of transparency about how that's operating. So, yeah, that might be something to consider.
And if that person also wants to have a look at the report that we wrote, my co-author Christy Hess has talked about how the ABC is considering collaborating with local news on the ground. Sort of almost like having freelance, I think, democracy reporters. So that might also be an opportunity for these local regional papers to collaborate with the ABC as a way to get funding as well.
I've got a couple of questions here about bias in the media, and also kind of, I guess, disinformation and the role of politics in, I guess, impacting on media and controlling media. People are interested, Ellie, in how Norway tackles, I guess, truthful information and coverage in the media, and the idea that journalism must be in the public interest. And how does Norway try and tackle disinformation, I guess, in this new age that we're living in?
Again, a very big question. How should I answer that? Well, one way of tackling is securing that there is professional journalism around. That's one thing. We do have all not all kinds of, but we of course have different types of outlets. Also, what is often called alternative right-wing media, where there have been a lot of discussion about whether they should actually qualify as newspapers, qualify for subsidies. That's also which they have not, most of them. So I think the tackling is that when they apply for subsidies, they are vetted and often fall out, because what is called news is not, they don't qualify for producing quality news. That's one thing. This is not without controversy. On the other hand, you have all the things that comes in with social media and with Facebook and so on. And I think the tackling of it, it's there, of course, like everywhere else, but the tackling of it is information. I think it's how we do it. The media authority itself, the overseer, the regulator, also has been targeting a lot of issues like media literacy for children is one thing, but also for the elderly, so that they should learn to vet and be critical of sources. So it's in the schools, of course. So there's a lot of ways of tackling that we have that have been used, but not one. There's not one strategy. It's kind of something that goes on all the time.
Maria, did you want to comment on efforts to combat disinformation in Australia?
Yeah, just briefly, I mentioned, saw as well the issue of bias, I think is a real problem here in Australia, that a lot of the public does see our media as biased. And so it sort of creates this vicious circle of why would we want to provide subsidies or public fundings to news organisations that we think are biased. I think that would be a real issue if we did start to discuss and debate the idea of direct subsidies. And yeah, that went up and down during COVID as well. But I think generally there's a great distrust in the Australian public about the media organisations that we have, and that's a real problem.
Maria, if I can stay with you for a second, just thinking about how Australia had fallen in the Press Freedom Index in recent years, we have also seen, because I guess in part because we don't have anything enshrined in our constitution to protect it, we've seen journalists, officers raided, news media organisations like the ABC and others raided by the federal police as part of investigations. We don't have very strong protections for whistleblowers who give information to journalists. What are some of those other things that we have to tackle to really strengthen freedom of the press and freedom of expression in Australia?
Yeah, so those were some of the other issues that the Reporters Without Borders Press Freedom Index raised. The fact that we have poor whistleblower laws and national security laws are also means that journalists can be raided and they can't protect their sources as well as data privacy and security laws as well. So that legal infrastructure is proving to be a huge challenge. There's also intimidation by politicians as well. That was another factor they cited as why we've slipped down, and we've seen some politicians sue journalists for defamation. So that's one way that they can do that. And another problem that they raised was also these cosy relationships between media executives and political leaders. And we've seen, anyone who's been following the Robo-Debt Royal Commission hearings would have actually seen the other day a government media advisor talking about how they leaked negative stories to friendly media. So we can see here how, and I'd be interested to hear from Ellie about whether this is an issue in Norway, whether the media is seen as too close to politicians.
Did you want to respond, Ellie?
Yes, and it's I think I have to go back to the fact that many years ago, all the press were all the newspapers were partisan, which means that even though the party press has more or less disappeared. Not totally. There are still newspapers that or outlets that belong to the parties. It means also that I don't think we can talk about a distrust of bias, because it's more or less in the system that when you have many outlets, some of them will advocate some views and some will advocate other views. And if, for instance, we have a small, very successful newspapers on the very, very extreme left, for instance, and of course nobody expects anybody on the right hand side to put much trust in, at least in the opinion articles in that newspaper. On the other hand, it's also known for having very good journalism on, for instance, environment, indigenous issues, economy, trade unions, and so on. So it's in a way, I think the audience is also trained to know that what's out there, you will not agree with everything. It's another issue with the with of course with the public broadcasters, which are supposed to be at least not partisan as in that sense, and they are supposed to be, if not objective, they are supposed to be critical and cover all views and so on. So again, Norway is not a paradise, but I think actually that characteristic of the system that's been there for such a long time still lives on in a way. So we don't actually expect people to trust the news. We want them to trust the news to a certain extent, but not more. And the idea is to be critical. But of course, with the extreme disinformation that came up during COVID and so on, that was more challenged. But again, it didn't become such a big problem as it did in other countries. I think we have to say that.
Okay. Ellie, can I just ask you to reflect, given the kind of discussion that we've had tonight, what's a key action point or something that the audience could kind of go home and do to either support more diverse media or public interest journalism? What's something that you'd like people to think about and do after they leave this evening? It's again a big question, but one of the things that I think makes sense and perhaps is possible is to, if you subscribe to an online or print or hybrid newspaper, try to keep it. That might be hard these days when prices are rocketing everywhere. But I think that's one of the ways that you really can subsidize and make a contribution to independent and professional journalism. And I think actually we need to have independent and professional journalism, and especially if it's an independent local newspaper. And we haven't talked much about that because there are so many of them, but that's really important. And on a higher level, but that's much more difficult, I would urge you to get some real protection of freedom of expression and freedom of the press in your constitution or in your legislation. That's also really, really important. And Maria, the same question for you. If people are wondering what they can go out to do and support either media diversity or public interest journalism, what would you want them to think about?
I agree with Ellie and would urge people to financially support a local, regional or independent news organisation. There's also great platforms here now like Substack where you can actually subscribe to independent journalists, not actually an organisation. But I did see that someone in the chat said, join Friends of the ABC, and they're a great noisy activist group that always lobby hard to keep funding for the ABC. But I would also suggest that people might look out for, I'm not sure if these reviews are going to have public submissions, but if they do, please have your voices heard and perhaps even talk about enshrining freedom of the press somewhere in our legislation.
Well, thank you everyone for a brilliant discussion. We will save the chat and make that available on our website along with the video from this evening's discussion in case you'd like to share it with anyone else. Don't forget to check out the Nordic Talks podcast. And thank you so much to both of our guests today, Professor Ellie Skogerbø and Dr. Maria Ray. Thank you to Nordic Talks for supporting this webinar.
This episode was recorded live on Thursday, the 2nd of February 2023, and things may have changed since recording. If you liked today's episode, please rate and review us. It helps other people to find the show. And if you love the show and want to help us continue to do work with real impact and influence, please consider supporting us with a small tax-deductible gift today at australiainstitute.org.au. That's also where you'll find all our latest research and content, and you can find us on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. My Twitter handle is ebony_Bennett with a _N_T. Ellie is at ESKOGER. Maria is at Maria Ray, that's Ray RAE 17. Our producer, Jennifer Macy, is at Jennifer Macy with additional editing by Emily Perkins. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions and with special thanks to Nordic Talks. Thanks for listening.